The twin suns blazed mercilessly over the endless stretch of red sand, painting the horizon in shimmering waves of heat. Captain Mark Ellison adjusted his visor, the advanced helmet barely keeping the searing temperatures at bay. His boots crunched against the parched ground as he surveyed the barren landscape. It was quiet, save for the faint hum of distant wind and the occasional static from his communicator. Isolation was a familiar companion here, far from Earth, far from the life he'd left behind. Mark's thoughts drifted to his wife, Emily. Her face, vivid in his memory, had been his anchor through long deployments. Yet, as weeks turned into months in this alien wasteland, even that memory had begun to fray like an old photograph exposed to too much light. He hated the creeping numbness that replaced the longing. Duty, he reminded himself. Focus on duty. Then, a flicker on the horizon snapped him out of his reverie. He froze, hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm holstered at his hip. The shimmering heat distorted the figure, but it was unmistakable. Someone or something was out there. Cautiously, Mark advanced, his weapon drawn. As he neared, the figure became clearer, a towering, statuesque figure bound in glowing chains. The being was unlike anything he'd ever encountered. Her skin was a translucent silver, reflecting the sunlight in an almost ethereal glow. Long, flowing hair cascaded down her back, shimmering like liquid starlight. She stood tall, easily over 8 feet, and though her features were alien, there was a striking elegance to her. "Help me?" The voice wasn't spoken. It resonated directly in his mind, soft yet commanding. Mark staggered back, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Who are you?" he demanded aloud, his voice hoarse from the dry air. "I am Zariel," the being replied, her lips unmoving. "I am not your enemy." Mark hesitated. Protocol dictated caution, yet her eyes, large, luminous, and filled with something akin to desperation, held him captive. "Why are you chained?" he asked, his voice steadier now. "They are the mark of my exile," she replied. "A punishment for defying the rules of my people. Please, I need your help to be free." The soldier in him wanted to dismiss her plea, to see her as nothing more than another alien in a galaxy full of dangers. Yet there was something in her voice, a vulnerability that pierced through his defenses. "Why should I trust you?" he challenged, narrowing his eyes. "Because you feel it too," she said, stepping closer. Her presence was overwhelming, majestic yet fragile. "This bond between us, it is not by chance that we have met." Mark swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He'd been trained to resist manipulation, yet this felt different. There was no malice in her gaze, only a quiet plea that mirrored his own unspoken loneliness. Against his better judgment, Mark holstered his weapon and stepped closer. The chains emitted a faint hum, and as his hand hovered over them, he felt a jolt of energy, not painful, but warm, almost familiar. "What happens if I free you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I regain my strength," Zariel said, her tone soft but certain. "And perhaps you regain something you've lost as well." The words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Mark's hand hovered for a moment longer before he grasped the chains. They shattered with a flash of light, dissipating into the air like sparks from a fire. Zariel staggered, but quickly regained her composure. She looked at him, her gaze filled with gratitude and something deeper. "You've made a choice," she said, "one that cannot be undone." Mark's chest tightened at the weight of her statement, but before he could respond, the desert wind howled around them, carrying whispers of an unseen force. "What now?" he asked, his voice steady but his heart racing. Zariel's gaze shifted toward the horizon. "Now we must run." The two figures disappearing into the endless desert, shadows stretching long under the twin suns. The outpost was little more than a relic of past wars, its walls scarred and its structure battered by the elements. Mark led Zariel through the rusted doorway, his pulse quickening. Inside, the dim light cast long shadows on the walls, the air heavy with dust and the faint scent of decay. He wasn't sure if this place could shelter them, but it was all he had to offer. Zariel moved gracefully despite her height, her luminous skin casting a faint glow in the dimness. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. "This world feels forgotten," she murmured, her voice tinged with sadness. Mark leaned against the wall, watching her. "This whole sector is forgotten. Just like this place." His words came out sharper than he intended, but he didn't care to soften them. This mission had ground him down, left him raw. And now, here he was, sheltering an alien exile with secrets he couldn't begin to unravel. Zariel turned to him, her gaze piercing. "And you? Are you forgotten too?" Her question struck a nerve, but Mark refused to flinch. "I'm here to do my job. That's all." She tilted her head, studying him with a curiosity that made him uneasy. "You carry more than duty, Captain Ellison. I see it in your eyes. You've lost something." He bristled. "Don't try to psychoanalyze me. You don't know anything about me." Zariel took a step closer, her presence filling the small space. "Perhaps not, but I know pain when I see it." Mark wanted to look away, to deflect, but her gaze held him captive. For the first time in months, someone had pierced the armor he'd built around himself. He hated how much that unnerved him. Breaking the tension, he turned and rummaged through his pack, pulling out a ration bar. "You need to eat," he said gruffly, tossing it to her. She caught it effortlessly, inspecting the wrapper with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "What is this?" "Food," he replied, sitting on a nearby crate. "Not gourmet, but it'll keep you alive." Zariel hesitated before opening it, her delicate fingers peeling back the wrapper. She took a cautious bite, her expression neutral. "Survival. Always survival," she said softly. Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "That's the universe for you. You adapt, or you die." Zariel met his gaze, her eyes shimmering in the faint light. "And yet, you saved me. Why?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Mark didn't have an answer, not one he wanted to admit. He had told himself it was the right thing to do, that any decent person would have done the same. But deep down, he knew there was more to it. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice low. Zariel took a step closer, her movements fluid, almost hypnotic. "You do," she said, her voice like a whisper carried on the wind. Mark felt his pulse quicken as she knelt before him, her height making the gesture feel intimate rather than submissive. "There is a bond between us," she said, her voice filled with quiet certainty. "One that transcends words or logic." He swallowed hard, torn between the pull of her presence and the weight of his own guilt. "This isn't right," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Zariel tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Right and wrong are constructs of your kind. In this moment, there is only us." Her words settled over him like a shroud, filling the space between them with an unspoken tension. Mark closed his eyes briefly, fighting the temptation to close that gap. The faint hum of an approaching storm broke the moment, the sound rattling through the decrepit outpost. Zariel rose gracefully, her gaze shifting toward the door. "They'll come for me," she said. "They always do." Mark stood, his jaw tightening. "Then we'll be ready." The storm brewing outside and a storm of emotions building between them, setting the stage for what's to come. The storm descended like a living force, battering the outpost with relentless winds that howled through the broken walls. The faint flicker of their single lantern cast moving shadows on the corroded metal, giving the space an eerie, intimate glow. Mark stared out at the storm, his thoughts a turbulent mirror of the chaos outside. Behind him, Zariel sat cross-legged on the floor, her silver skin gleaming faintly in the dim light. She seemed unaffected by the storm's ferocity, her expression serene, though her gaze never left him. "You're restless," she observed, her voice soft yet cutting through the roar of the wind. Mark turned to her, his brow furrowed. "Hard not to be. We're trapped here, waiting for whatever comes next." Zariel tilted her head, her hair spilling over her shoulders like liquid moonlight. "It's not the storm that troubles you. It's what you feel inside." Mark sighed, running a hand over his face. "You talk like you know me." "I do," she replied simply. Not through words, but through what you cannot hide. Your heart is loud, Captain Ellison. It screams of pain, longing, guilt. He bristled at her words, anger flashing briefly across his face. You don't know anything about my life. You don't know the sacrifices I've made. Zariel rose fluidly, her towering form commanding yet gentle. Then tell me, she said, stepping closer. Show me what binds you to this suffering. Mark wanted to push her away, to keep the barriers he'd carefully built intact. But the weight of her gaze broke something inside him. He exhaled shakily and sat down on the edge of an old crate. My wife, he began, his voice low and strained. Emily, she's everything I've fought for, everything I've tried to protect. But this distance, this mission, it's tearing us apart. And I don't even know if she feels the same way anymore. Zariel knelt before him, her luminous eyes locked onto his. You fear she's forgotten you, she said gently. Mark nodded, shame prickling at his skin. I can't shake the thought. And now, I'm here, with you, feeling things I shouldn't be feeling. What kind of man does that make me? Zariel reached out, her hand hovering inches from his face. It makes you human, she said. Your kind clings to love, even when it fades. But love does not belong to one moment, one person. It evolves, as do we. Her words struck a chord deep within him. He closed his eyes, her proximity overwhelming his senses. This isn't right, he murmured, his voice barely audible. Zariel's fingers brushed his cheek, her touch cool and electric. Right and wrong are illusions, she said. What exists between us is truth. Let yourself feel it. Mark opened his eyes, meeting hers. The storm outside seemed to fade into nothingness as the space between them dissolved. Against every voice in his head screaming to stop, he leaned in. Their lips met in a kiss that was both tentative and consuming, a collision of worlds and emotions. Zariel's touch was unlike anything he had ever experienced, otherworldly yet achingly familiar. Time seemed to halt, the storm a mere whisper beyond the walls. When they finally pulled apart, Mark's chest heaved with a mixture of exhilaration and guilt. Zariel rested her forehead against his, her eyes closed. This moment was always meant to be, she whispered. Mark pulled back, his thoughts a chaotic tangle. What have I done? Zariel's gaze softened, though her expression was unreadable. You've embraced what was already within you. There is no shame in that. Before he could respond, a sharp sound pierced the air, a distant but distinct hum that Mark recognized all too well. They're here, he said grimly, rising to his feet. Zariel stood beside him, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension flooding his veins. Then we must face them together. Mark gripping his weapon, torn between his duty and the bond he can no longer deny, as shadows approached through the storm. The storm had quieted, but the air remained heavy with tension. Through the shattered windows of the outpost, Mark saw the silhouettes of Zariel's pursuers moving steadily through the sand, their forms blurred by the lingering haze. Their weapons glinted under the twin suns, promising violence. They've found me, Zariel said, her voice calm yet resolute. She stood beside Mark, her presence radiating an almost unearthly serenity. Mark clenched his jaw, his weapon gripped tightly in his hands. Who are they? Enforcers, she replied, sent to return me to my people, bound and broken. They will not tolerate my defiance. He glanced at her, his heart pounding. And if they take you back? Her gaze shifted to him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. They will erase me, my mind, my spirit. I will become nothing but a shadow of what I was. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The weight of her words settled over him like a stone, and the enormity of his next decision loomed. He had freed her, crossed a line with her, and now her fate rested squarely in his hands. You don't have to stay, Zariel said softly, her voice breaking through his thoughts. You owe me nothing. If you leave now, they may let you go. Mark turned to her sharply. Don't say that. I made a choice, and I'm not about to abandon you now. Her lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile. You've already risked so much for me. I would not see you lose everything. The sound of footsteps drew closer, cutting off their exchange. Mark steadied his breath, his soldier's instincts kicking in. Stay behind me, he ordered. The enforcers entered the outpost, their weapons raised and glowing with an energy unfamiliar to Mark. Their leader, a towering figure clad in intricate armor, stepped forward. His voice boomed through the room, cold and commanding. Zariel, surrender yourself. Your rebellion ends here. Zariel stepped out from behind Mark, her chin held high. I will not return to a life of servitude, she said. You may take my body, but you will never have my spirit. The leader's gaze flickered to Mark, his expression hardening. And you, human, this is not your fight. Leave now, and you will be spared. Mark felt the weight of the offer, but he didn't waver. She's under my protection, he said firmly. If you want her, you'll have to go through me. The enforcers raised their weapons, but Zariel stepped forward, her presence commanding their attention. Enough, she said, her voice resonating with power. I will not let others pay for my freedom. Mark turned to her, his eyes wide. What are you doing? She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch sending a shiver down his spine. You have given me more than I could have hoped for, she said softly. But this is my fight, not yours. Before he could protest, a surge of energy erupted from her, a dazzling light that forced the enforcers and Mark to shield their eyes. When the light faded, Zariel stood alone, her chains gone, her presence radiant and unyielding. The enforcers hesitated, their weapons lowering. The leader's voice wavered. What is this power? It is the strength of freedom, Zariel said, and you will not take it from me again. The enforcers retreated, their resolve broken. Zariel turned to Mark, her expression soft but resolute. It is time for us to part, she said. Mark's chest tightened. No, She silenced him with a gentle touch. You must return to your world, to the life you left behind. I will carry this bond with me, always. He watched helplessly as she stepped into the desert, her form disappearing into the horizon. The weight of her absence settled over him, but deep down, he knew she had given him something priceless, a chance to reclaim himself. Mark standing alone, the storm now a distant memory, as he turns back toward his own uncertain future.